Today we're going to learn about how to multiply and divide integers and those rules that we need to follow. So here are the rules. When we multiply or divide a positive by a positive, it's a positive. Now, this is what you first learned how to multiply and divide. So if we have 10 divided by 5, the answer is 2. You don't have to think about these. If we have 4 times 5, the answer is positive 20. So when it's all positive, it stays positive. Now, the same kind of idea, if we have a negative times a negative, or a negative divided by a negative, then that answer is also positive. And we're going to work on why during our buzz math today. But a visual that I look at is these two negatives kind of combine together like in a superpower, and they go and they form a positive. Those two negatives form a positive. Now you have to be careful because sometimes people overgeneralize this rule and they put it in towards adding. But we know when we're adding, a negative plus a negative stays a negative because you owe $5 and you owe 3 more, so you still owe 8. So that's just a little warning to be careful. Make sure you know what operation you're using. The rules are very different if you're adding versus multiplying or dividing. Now we get our combinations. If we have a positive times a negative or a positive divided by a negative, that answer is going to be a negative. Same other situation, reverse that. If we have a negative times a positive or a negative divided by a positive, that answer is going to be negative. Some people like to say if they're the same, then the sign's going to always be positive. If they're different, then that is always going to be negative. So here are our steps to go ahead and solve. Our first step to solve an actual problem for these is we just ignore all the negatives and we pretend that everything is positive, and we just multiply or divide normally using our calculator if we need to do so. And then we determine the sign using these rules. So we look at those two numbers and we're like, hey, okay, they're both negative, so I know my answer is going to be positive. So you write your answer using that correct sign. But if you don't have them memorized, it's harder. So we want to make sure that we have these down. Now we have a couple weird situations going on. If we have a whole string of numbers that we're looking at, we can multiply all those numbers normally, but then we go ahead and take a look at the number of negatives. So if I'm multiplying 5 negatives together, then that's an odd number. If I'm multiplying 4 negatives together, then that's an even. So if I have an even number of negatives in my problem that I'm multiplying or dividing together, each of those individual ones pair up. And so when they all pair up and there's no negatives left over. So an even number is going to be a positive answer. And an odd number of negatives is going to be a negative answer because they pair up and there's one left over. Here's our first example. Here we have 5 times negative 4. We're going to go ahead and multiply normally. 5 times 4 is 20. I see that it's a positive times a negative, which makes my answer a negative 20. This is like owing $4 5 times. So I owe $4, then I owe $8, then I owe $12, then I owe $16, then I owe $20. So I still owe $20, which is why it's a negative answer. For our example 2, we have negative 6 divided by negative 2. We ignore the sign. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And then we see that there's 2 negatives. Those 2 negatives pair up and become a positive. So my answer is positive 3. Example 3, I have negative 22 times negative 4. I go ahead and I ignore and I do 22 times 4, which is 88. And I see that those 2 negatives pair together and make a positive. For example 4, I have 3 numbers. So I have 5 times 2 is 10. 10 times 3 is 30. I then count my number of negatives and I see that there's 3. That is an odd number. That means 2 of them pair up. We have 1 left over, and that makes our answer negative 30. We're going to go ahead and get some more practice on this in BuzzMath.